welcome, and thank you so much for coming. I was asked to speak at a conference in Fukuyama in Japan, and the subject that I was asked to speak on was the history of roses in California. So I'm sharing with you today the talk I gave to 600, 700 people in that conference. It didn't go over very well. So I have a feeling you'll get it maybe a little bit better. So my question to the audience first was, so you want to know the history of roses in California. Where shall I begin? Should it be 3 million years ago when roses first appeared in California and in what we call the United States today? Or should I just go back to when the first human beings moved in there? And that was 15,000 years ago. And I decided to start with that, with the background of what nature had been doing in spreading roses around for 3 million years. The people who originally were exploring the Pacific coast early on, they believed that California was an island. And that was most likely because Baja California is a great, huge peninsula that stretches down from California. And those who traveled up into Baja just thought it just kept on going until it met the Pacific Ocean. But it's a great metaphor for actually what California is, which is it's a place that is very much isolated from the rest of the continent. All of the Pacific coast is kind of like that. Each of these areas like Oregon and Washington and Alaska are very isolated from other places in terms of across land. So it's isolated because of the mountains to the west and the north, the intense deserts to the southeast, and then of course this giant edge of the Pacific Ocean, which is very cold and has absolute mastery over our climate. It's one of those unusual places we call a Mediterranean climate, where, as you know, there's a period of dry in the year, and then there's a period of wet in the year, and those fluctuate somewhat, but there isn't a long period of very cold, freezing weather, the Pacific Ocean has the most impact on what California is, because it dumps all of this rain at a period of the year, because it hits these mountain ranges to the east and to the north, and all the rain hits those mountains, comes down, and has created this amazing network of rivers and streams throughout California. But beyond rivers and streams, all of these rivers had massive wetlands that were associated with them. The wetlands of California have been reduced by something like 80% since Europeans began to live here. But these freshwater wetlands that once dominated California and the Bay Area in particular, all the way up into the Sacramento Valley and down into the San Joaquin Valley. The San Joaquin Valley, a great example of the conditions there. Just 2 years ago, there was so much rain in the Sierras that an enormous lake that was drained by people in the 20th century filled back up again. It was all farmland, and now it's a lake again. It's such a major lake that's been rebuilt that we can't mechanically just drain it again. We have to wait until it becomes part of the landscape and drains itself. So we've lost these places on a massive scale. Why are these places so important? Wetlands, freshwater wetlands, by their nature, are what animals require to live in, to survive, and plants must have water to live in. California has a lot of different ecologies. The largest ecology of all that it had were the wetlands and the coast, where the forests were, the redwood forests were. So people migrating to North America from Asia, as we know, happened across a land bridge that's now the Bering Strait, migrated slowly. They didn't migrate halfway across the Bering Sea or whatever strait. They left the place they were in, moving away from whatever dangers or lack of necessities that they were faced with, to see if they could find a better place. And they didn't have to go very far. And they did this incrementally, generation after generation, slowly moving across the land until they reached North America. And then they slowly moved throughout North America, across the Isthmus of Panama and into South America. So thousands of years it took for all of this colonization by human beings of North and South America. How did they know where to go? How did they know what were the signs that they were going to be coming into a place that they could live in? Well, obviously things like food, animals that they could consume, plants that they could consume. They needed the signs that in that area, in that place, they had it. What California had was, it was the largest freshwater stopover point in all of North America. And so the Central Valley was flooded the winter rains flooded the dry valley and it remained flooded for several months. And so through the winter rain period and into the spring, California was completely overcome by migratory birds, insects, mammals, you name it. Everything came through there at that time of year to eat. So people easily followed those animals into a place like California. And it wasn't an easy place to get to. And in fact, it was one of the last places that was colonized by human beings coming into North America, because of the isolation of the mountains around it and the desert. This is a picture of my little town of Sebastopol, and you can see at the top some flooded areas which are part of what is known as the Laguna de Santa Rosa, which is the big plain that goes between Sebastopol and this larger city, Santa Rosa. It's now 95% filled, and has been since the 1930s. But it still remains as a channel. Whatever filling that they've tried to do, they couldn't actually stop the water. So there is a trickle now, which is a fairly sizable stream, and it's great huge lakes in the area to the top of this picture and below those existing lakes. That stretched for 25 miles from its origins up in just below Healdsburg, California, all the way down to the city of Cotati. And that laguna now, most people who live in this area don't even know it's there. Except when you cross a bridge into Sebastopol, and it's dry in the summer, and you wouldn't know that that was a stream. In that stream grew the largest stand of our native Rosa californica that has ever been documented. It stretched for 25 miles. And And the roses of California are rose species, are all species that live in these wetlands. They are built genetically to be able to be completely flooded for months through the winter, because because in those marshy areas it drains, it dries out by the summertime, and the roses can leaf out and they can grow and they have enough oxygenation at their roots. So these marshlands all throughout California were the place where our 9 native species roses grew. Well, actually 8 of those 9 grew there. This is Rosa californica, which is the one that covers more territory in California than any of the other species. It's a nice rose because it gets to head height and a little bit taller. It suckers very close together and makes these very dense stands. It's a great thing to plant as a fence to keep deer out, because deer won't jump over it. They will eat the flowers on the side they can get to, and they'll go around and go somewhere else. But they also were protected from the deer because they were in the marshlands. When they were blooming, it was too soggy and wet for the deer to go into those areas. 5 of our species of rose, the genus Rosa in California, one of them is Nootkana exists throughout the Pacific Northwest. We have smaller stands of it in California, mostly on the coast. One of these 5, Rosa minutifolia, is the exception. There are 2 species in North America that are in this group that are desert roses. And they go dormant for as much as 10 months of the year. When and if they get winter rain, they grow rapidly. They will have died back to a great extent over a very dry spell. And then when the rain finally hits, the old dead twigs and the live parts stay there, and from the roots come up these great huge stems that come up and they make a parabolic arch, and they go straight back down to the ground again, and they tip root. Every single one tip roots. And it's because the plant has simply changed, its genetics have allowed it to be able to survive that. So it's pretty amazing that roses pretty much conquered every possible part of California, including some very high parts of the high altitude parts of the Sierra Nevadas. So this is the sort of the most important wetland of all of California. And it kind of sits a little bit in the middle, you know, it's considered Northern California, but it really kind of is this anchor in the middle. It's kind of made the coastline of California what it is today over eons. And it is these rivers from the Sacramento and the San Joaquin, the whole watershed area of the Sacramento Valley, much of which has been dammed and diked and channeled, almost all of it now channeled. And most of the major wetlands around our capital have been filled in, and houses are being built on them as we speak. This, we see all the in the East Bay in California, you see all the pale coloring, which are all the cities along the East Bay, and virtually 80% of the land that you see that has growth, has buildings in it on that side, are on filled wetlands. So 90% of San Francisco Bay is gone because it was filled in. The wetlands were in the way. And they were seen as a great way to have nice level land to build cheaply on. The Native Americans who lived in the Bay Area were probably the most peaceful Native Americans towards the Westerners who came in, because they had such an abundance of opportunities for food. They had a very protective, mild climate to live in. They had all the water they needed. They could, if they had a very bad year with green things that they ate, or with animals that they ate, they could simply clean the edges of the bay of all the oysters and mollusks that lived there in those wetlands. All of those mollusks are now gone. So we made a big transformation of a state that affected everything, and it really had a major impact on the largest number of roses that exist in any place in America outside of perhaps the state of Washington. So the acreage that was growing in roses was massive. The peoples who came first to California, the human beings who moved in and finally got into California and were able to colonize it and live there, have a very different perspective on the landscape and on plants like roses than we do. It's, I think, a much more lyrical and poetic perspective, one that is in tune with nature and not against it. Water does have a memory. It does have emotions and feelings. And we know that because it runs through and comes out of us. So just you ponder that statement for a bit, and it tells you something about what we miss, what we're still not seeing. Melanie Smokey is an amazing woman who, thanks to, well, we'll just read this. The rose. It's like when you go and give someone a hug, someone you really care about, that's how the rose is. You can get medicine just by breathing it in. So, to me, that's the first primal piece of history of the rose in California. Because history is people and what they see and how they record what they see. And when people came there, they had an opinion about the roses. Why were the roses so important to them? I believe they were important because they knew them already. Their ancestors knew them. They were a part of their culture when they were Asian people. The generations that came after them kept that lore. As they moved into North America, roses were there. And roses were already the wetland plants that gave them an understanding that was a possible place where life could be. Notwithstanding that, simply we know that they used roses both for food, for the hips of the fruit of the rose, and also, and more importantly, as Melanie Smokey says, for the fragrance of the flowers, which we understand now that perfume and fragrances can have a powerful impact on certain parts of our brain that control our emotions, our sense of well-being, our sense of being in a protected, safe place. That rose, Rosa Damascena bifera, the repeat blooming damask rose, was a rose that was known by Europeans well. It goes back at least 3,000 years to the first plantations in Egypt 3,000 years ago of roses planted in fields for collecting the petals, for using the petals to perfume water, or to simply sit in baskets to perfume a room in a house. It was such a lucrative trade for the Egyptians 3,000 years ago that when the Romans conquered them, almost 1,000 years later, the greatest prize the Romans wanted was the rose plants. And they took them. And they took them to places that they had control over, and they began planting fields that the Romans then prized. This rose is a pretty special rose. Certainly the Spanish, the French, all knew it. But it was the Spanish that had come to Mexico, conquered the Aztecs, and moved across and took over Mexico. And as they were moving through Mexico, they encountered this rose. And at the end of the 18th century, this rose was brought to Empress Josephine. The botanist named it Rosa Montezuma for the leader of the Aztecs. It looks just like Rosa californica, if you ask me. It's a simple, small-flowered wild rose that grows in wet areas and grew around the Great Lake that was filled in by the Spanish, that was Mexico City, that now is Mexico City. So Mexico City was this Aztec engineered water feature where water was stored for the people who lived in the city. And this rose grew all around the banks of that lake. The Mexicans, as they passed through, heading further west toward the Pacific coast, encountered many things. And they remarked that this rose was the Rose of Castile. The Rose of Castile being this rose, or a seedling of this rose. And there are many forms of the damask rose that we know that have been used in Europe for the production of oil of roses. Bulgaria, parts of Armenia, many places in the south of France and northern Italy grew this for the Roman Empire. And many of those forms were just 5 or 10 petals, simple flowers. Some of them, mostly they were raised from seed, so some of them were simple as their ancestors were. So there is this notion that has been passed around that because we have found this rose growing in many of the old missions that the Spanish padres developed up the El Camino Real in California from Mexico. There's an assumption has been made that these roses were planted on purpose by the padres because they were bringing them from Spain where they grew this rose. But in fact, there is no evidence that that is the case. Much more likely, this very special form of the damask rose that not only reblooms but has lots of petals, was most likely brought in by ship, as so many things were in that era in the 1600s and 1700s. Explorers like Sir Francis Drake and others who explored the coastline of California noted important landing places like the Monterey Bay, began to, explored California, but actually for a couple of hundred years, nothing much more was done until finally the Padres were told by the Mexican government that they needed to establish these their churches and move the Mexican state of California, populate that area. This is a great example of the European perspective of the colonization of California. And this is in Monterey, Father Junipero Serra giving Mass to the soldiers and the workers who have come with him. And you notice on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, there's in the dark shadows of the tree in the rocks, the Indians are looking over and wondering what's going to happen next. We know that in places like Monterey, I'll take you back once more to this one here. The galleons that you see at the top are a painting made of a Portuguese galleon arriving in the Orient. And the Portuguese had this amazing trade route from the Philippines to California. They went from the Philippines all the way up to north of San Francisco and then down one of the streams that travel south from Alaska towards Mexico. So it was a fast route to come down through. The Portuguese were responsible for bringing an immense amount of material and goods to California from the Philippines. And those goods were brought to the Philippines from Spain from many different directions. But these early roses that came in turn out to have come not directly from Spain or from Europe at all, but from roses like Lamarck, Madame Plantier, Le Vesuve, Chromatella, very likely were brought from the Philippines by Portuguese galleons. The Spanish city that began to be created in Monterey was the place where the wealthiest of the Spanish settled. They could have a nice rancho in great weather, and they had all the Indians they needed to do all the work for them. And this is one of the things that's documented over and over and over again, is that the indigenous tribes of California were simply looked at as laborers. And they did the work. And they were asked to pray to a new god, a thing that they didn't actually understand at all, because their idea of their relationship to a higher being were just so different from ours. All they knew was that they were told to do it, and they did it. There are many roses that we have found, the heritage rose groups in California have found in our searches over the past 40 years. And this is one that is particularly extraordinary because this bourbon rose was found at San Juan Bautista, just north of Monterey. It looks very similar to what we have received from European rose collections as Rose de l'Île de Bourbon, the first bourbon rose. I have both this and the European received plant of the bourbon rose, and they're not the same, but they're very similar. But the reason this is there is that it came to Monterey on a galleon from the Philippines at the beginning of the 18th century, the 19th century. And it's kind of astonishing because it's very likely that that rose came from India to the Philippines and from the Philippines to California, not on a ship coming around the Horn or a ship disembarking all of its cargo in Panama, taking it overland to the Pacific Ocean, putting it on another ship and taking it up. That's why the Portuguese route was so important, because they were, it was this circular thing that just moved goods around from one point that they controlled to another. San Rafael, just south of where I live in Marin County, north of San Francisco, was the last stand for the Padres for the creation of Mexican settlements in California. And this is getting into the 19th century, moving into close into the point when the state of California changed hands. And that was when people like John Bidwell, Americans came across the land in wagons, in wagon trains, to California to buy land from the Mexicans, buy parts of the ranchos that the Mexicans had taken from the Indian tribes. They came with money, they came with know-how, they came with entourage of family and also skilled workers to quickly create a settlement that was going to be successful and make money. And they came bearing plants as well, I must say. We know they came bearing a number of roses that were dear to them from where they came in the eastern United States. So those would be all these old roses that we think about, the Gallicas and so forth. More importantly were the China and tea roses that came with some of these wagon trains to California. They had a larger impact ultimately. The biggest impact, however, was that when Americans began successfully moving into California, it became a rush. And people came fast, and they came furious, and they were desperate to get a piece of land. And the Native Americans in California had been moved away from the areas where Americans wanted to live and they wanted to have farms and grow orchards and live the kind of farming lives that they knew how to live. They couldn't understand that a group of 25 Indians required a space from of many miles long to move throughout the year to places that provided the needs that they had for their many activities and things that they did and created. That didn't make any sense. They didn't understand why they didn't just change and adopt the better way of life. And finally, the government simply gave in to the desire of some very violent residents in California who simply wanted to exterminate as many Indians as quickly as they could. So I know this doesn't seem to have anything to do with roses, but to me it's the understory that we need to understand and accept before we can truly appreciate the value of roses and the value of any good thing that we have in our lives. Then came, of course, the gold rush. And I don't need to say an awful lot about that because I think most people understand that when gold was found in a stream in California in the foothills of the Sierras, word got out and every ship in the Pacific Ocean headed to San Francisco. Every ship in the Atlantic headed to San Francisco. This is the very, very beginning in 1851. All of these ships and 10 times more were pushed into that harbor side by side, tied together, holes punched in the hulls to sink them. They even filled the boats with sand and gravel and whatever they could get into them to make them sink. And then they put landfill across everything to fill that entire thing in. What you see over there is part of Yerba Buena Island, looking towards Oakland, and this is the old financial district right here, which gets expanded out. So all the wharfs in San Francisco are out there in the water someplace. That many people coming into a place as quickly as they did, on top of the already huge amount of pressure to give land to people for people to have land to live in, to farm in, to build a town in. The gold fever had one unintended side effect, and that was that Native Americans could pan for gold, and they already knew how to do it better than Europeans did. Sometimes they were paid to do it, but they could also do it on their own. And so could the Chinese, who had built these railroads across our country, and who had built San Francisco. Some of them were bold enough to go out on their own, find gold, and change their lives. The little silver lining. The really ugly thing was almost beyond what was done to the Native Americans, which was to devastate the landscape in the gold country and in other areas in order to building lakes like this, artificial lakes like this, which were mined for the bits of gold with these are blades that slow the flow down, but basically taking all the water from the rivers and emptying them not back where they were, but emptying them into the landscape, just destroying everything downstream. They brought in hydraulic pumps to pump that water and carve out pieces of the mountains to get the gold to come down in the streams. These scars will never go away in California.
McCullough Diggins.
Yeah. So the Americans arrived, they got rich, they built great big cities like Sacramento, and they died. They died and cemeteries had to be made for them. And one of the greatest cemeteries that was made in California was the Sacramento Old City Cemetery. That cemetery, at its heyday in the 1880s, right there in the top left, and you can see people built gardens in those plots. They planted all kinds of plants, and they planted roses galore. And this was true throughout the gold country and throughout California. These big cemeteries were being built. People had the wealth to buy a plot in a cemetery to bury their beloved mothers and fathers and children. And to plant roses on those graves. And roses were so highly prized that people often would spend vast amounts of money on roses for gardens. In the 1970s, when the Heritage Roses group began in El Cerrito, the first meeting that was announced had so many people, there were something like 275 people who wanted to attend that meeting. And we all met friends, and they were young. They were our age. They were falling in love with old roses that they found in the towns they lived in. And they couldn't find any information about them. They wanted to learn. So all these people got together, and the knowledgeable people shared their knowledge. They passed it on to others. They inspired others to become even more knowledgeable. And we had 35 years of amazing relationships with people, with the gardens that we came to see the roses in, and with the cemeteries. And one of the byproducts of that community that we built was a desire we saw what was happening to the cemeteries. We saw in many cemeteries where there was no water in the summer, these old roses were still living. They were giant. They grew beautifully because we had this magnificent climate with not enough cold to damage even tea roses in the foothills of California. So we wanted to replant some of these cemeteries where the cemetery leaders had decided to remove rose plants. And one of the places that was designated by one group in the foothills was this old city cemetery in Sacramento. 25 years ago, a group of people started a volunteer project to plant the roses that we had all gathered from various places, shared with each other in one beautiful cemetery that was fitting for the grandest of roses. 25 years, this group of people worked diligently maintaining this planting. And in 3 years' time, the city, through the bureaucracy, decided that they didn't belong there. And although they didn't dig them out, they had them cut down to about 6 inches from the ground. And when they got up again to a couple of feet, they had them cut down again. So there's some pretty negative things that human beings are capable of doing. But what doesn't stop us, it does not stop us from valuing the beauty and the kindness and the love that is there. In 1860, this Japanese steam warship, the Kanrin Maru, which I found in Japan every school child knows the name of, was the first ship to come into San Francisco Bay. This was after Commodore Perry broke the blockade of Western influence in Japan, and the Americans invited the Japanese to send a warship to California with ambassadors. And these were the ambassadors. They were also members of the crew of the ship. So for the first time, San Francisco, California had a new Japanese population, and it centered in San Francisco. A few decades later, the California Midwinter Expo happens. It is on the site of our museum complex in the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. You can see the form of the land that is still there, now with different buildings on either side. This was the first of these imperial efforts on the part of business in California to attract people to come and see the wares that we were creating in California, to bring in people from around the world to share the products they were making as well. So it was a big commercial enterprise. And in the heart of this place, an Australian came, and his contribution was he was a garden maker, and he knew something about Japanese gardens, and he built what he thought was a Japanese garden, which was the hit of the entire exposition for a year. And it was so successful that John McLaren, the designer of Golden Gate Park, who lived in the park from the beginning of its development until it was finished, hired Makoto Hajiwara, a titled Japanese young man who immigrated to California from Japan, having done a complete degree in the creation of gardens, both in Japanese traditional style and in Western style. And he came and lived in Marin County and made magnificent Japanese gardens for people in Marin County. This is just before the turn of the century. And McLaren came to him after the expo ended and said, "Would you take this garden on and make it a real Japanese garden?" And so he did, and a house was built in the garden that he and his family could live in forever. That was the deal. So that's 1897 to 1925. And less than 20 years later, the war with Japan broke out. And the family, the Hajiwara family was sent to camps in Colorado. And they were not welcomed back to. But in 1920, a year or two after the end of the war, the daughter who had taken over from her father in the maintenance of the garden was finally asked to come back, to bring her father, and for her to continue this tradition, family tradition, of seeing that the garden was properly maintained. So there's a good story ending to this. There now came a phase at the beginning of the 20th century where the history that everybody wants to know about roses in California actually begins. And that is when Californians began to actually create new hybrids. Now, if you read Daryl Schramm's book called Rainbow, and I'll show you a picture at the end, he documents everything in the 19th century with the breeding that was done, mostly well after the gold rush when roses began to be bred. By the turn of the century, suddenly people like Luther Burbank inspired many more people to take breeding seriously, and rose breeding really took off. These expositions were what kind of created a mystique around San Francisco that continues to this day as a sort of imperial city of the West. But after World War II was the real opportunity for roses to be there for everyone. And that was mid-century in California, starting in the 40s and going through the 60s, when most of the really innovative breeding of roses happened. The advancement of rose breeding began to be focused in California. People like Fred Howard, one of the greats of all time breeding in California, had a great effect. Well, one of the things that I think is emblematic about this period is it was the period after the war when many more people could afford to buy a house. There was wealth being distributed best throughout our whole country. And housing developments were going in everywhere. And this new idea of aesthetics, which grew directly out of the influence of the Japanese coming to California and building gardens and showing people a different aesthetic of beauty. And to me, it's really, it shows best in the use of the natural color of wood and the natural textures. California has been a wonderful place for gardens, and these are just some of the gardens that, the kinds of gardens that have been created. One of my favorites, which is the garden that Elaine worked in for many, many, many years, is the UC Berkeley Botanic Garden, which in the 1980s, I believe it was, this garden at the top of the hill that overlooks the Golden Gate Bridge was built. And it was built by the people who had been part of this movement to who loved old roses. And structures were made, a selection of plants were made that gave a whole overview historically of roses, from the very oldest to the most modern, almost the most modern, certainly the greats of the mid-century. Today, gardens like Pamela Temple's in the wilds of Willits, California, where she plants ramblers up this magnificent series of hills around her, all around. The classic amphitheater of roses, it's the Berkeley Rose Garden. And there's a Marischal Neal in my front garden. So I haven't told you really an awful lot of information about roses in their history in California, But that's in part because these two books have more information than you would even be able to absorb if you spent 6 months reading them and rereading them. One of them is Darrell Schramm's History of the Rose in California. He starts with the wild roses and gives some really important information about how to figure out what variety, what species it is. And then in 2005, we held a conference for the Heritage Rose Foundation in California, in El Cerrito, on the weekend of the celebration of old roses, so that we could have a couple of days of conference followed by this grand display of old roses. And I worked with a group, with 3 other people, editing and creating this book, which was written by all of the people who had been in our Heritage Roses group over the years, who had these different knowledge areas and perspectives, and could really fill us in on a part of the history that's always overlooked, which is the people who really participate in it most deeply. So I encourage you to get these. You can purchase this through the Heritage Rose Foundation, the California's Rose Heritage, and online you can buy Darrell's book, Rainbow. I thank you very much.
I have Darrell's Schramm's Rainbow book, and I just love his style. He just goes into depth, but it's just a great, easy reading style.
Yeah. He's a poet, and he writes well.
I think so too, yes.
So.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that was fascinating. And now, if anybody has questions, did you have a mic or something?
The second mic's not working, but we'll get his answers.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Any questions?
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
I grew
When
up
will the recording be up?
As soon as I get it done.
I grew up in Sacramento, had family in Oakland, went to college in Chico, and thank you for adding to my knowledge, historic knowledge of my home. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's so many things I didn't know. Thank
Yeah.
you so much. We visited some people in Downey, I think, California, where there were a lot of Welsh miners, and they brought roses with them. There's supposedly a wealth of that there, but I look forward to checking out these books. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yes?
I was just curious about whether the Chinese people brought roses with them when they came.
No, and that's because in China, at that time in China, the rose had been kind of repressed as a symbol by the Han Dynasty, and their symbolic flower was the peony, and that was a northern environment, so peonies were good, whereas the Sung Dynasty was in the south, where these hybrids that the Chinese began making at least 700 years ago to 1,000 years ago. And they were based upon southern Chinese species that were more tender. So Rosa chinensis spontanea, Rosa gigantea, Rosa, what's called, the ancestor of the tea rose. And that's actually a complex of different wild roses from China. So, first of all, the Chinese were just not very aware of roses, and the people who came were largely working people, the poorest of the poor, who would do anything to escape the poverty that they lived in and the starvation cycles. So they didn't come with anything, really. It's only now that the Chinese are actually waking up to their history of being one of the greatest producers of roses ever in human history. So, yes?
Was there ever a time where a black market for roses developed, where like demand outstrips supply and things like that?
I would say that would be right now. Right now, we're in that moment.
Really?
Because roses have become virtually impossible to import into the United States. And there is a black market now that's happening on the internet. Roses that are being bred in Japan right now are among the most beautiful ever. And when people see them, they want them. And so there are people online who advertise that they'll sell these roses, that named varieties that are bred in Japan. But what people are finding is that they pay the money, and often the plants are shipped. But because they're not shipped with any documentation for inspection, phytosanitary inspection, they're just destroyed by the USDA when they come in. So
Is there counterfeiting that's going on?
I don't think so. I suspect that I know a lot of people who are getting these roses and have heard these stories, and I know that there's kind of an effort afoot to get some nursery to have a nursery begin to duplicate these plants and then begin selling them. But
Is that because of commerce, the threat to U.S. nursery commerce? Is that why they're...
well, yeah, I mean, you all know in Oregon, we know in California that there's so many diseases and insects that are coming in that destroy crops that have nothing to do with roses, but we could bring them in and we could be responsible. So we have very stringent laws, and California is really good at, at least on its main incoming routes, stopping people and demanding to inspect if they feel there's a reason to. So, thank you.